Psycho. So, about everything in order. All I can say about myself is that I am a first-year student at a provincial university, but a rather prestigious one in our suburbs. Though I have a few trusted friends myself, I spend most of my time either alone or with my family. I will sketch a small plan of our suburban town: administration, White House, police, hospital, schools, etc. Everything is as usual. There is also an old madhouse, closed under Tsar Gorok, dilapidated and forgotten, standing in the once picturesque place, which is now overgrown with weeds, bushes and small trees. Actually, that's what we're going to talk about. I begin the story. Although I am a fairly reserved person, the company of 2 to 3 people will not bother me, especially friends, and especially if the hookup with them something interesting. I haven't lived in the city that long, so I've only made 3 good friends so far, and avoided the others. Of those 3, 2 were newcomers, Vazia and Sergey, and 1 was Anton, a native. One day, when the snowstorm had stopped, we cooperated in order to get into some abandoned house, and have a little get-together there, a kind of winter get-together. As an abandoned house we chose this very same abandoned asylum, although there was also an option of a burnt-out house, but it had no roof. We reached the building by foot through the snowdrifts in the afternoon. With difficulty we pushed back the piling snow with the door, and pushed our way in. It was eerily dark in the corridor, and one of us switched on a flashlight. We all had one. We looked around. It was just like any other abandoned building. My friends had been there before, but this was the first time I had been there. We made our way to the door to the corridor, where we could see a strip of light. The 4 of us stepped out into the hallway, which was quite bright from the snow behind the windows, and quite expansive. There were 2 peeling beams in front of the reception area with a broken window. To give you a better idea of the place, I suggest you think back to the local hospital and age it by 20 years, add the tons of people drinking on the first floor during that time, and take a look at the resulting picture. The place could be called a monument to abandonment. We knocked out the lantern and walked out into the center of the room. There were aisles to the sides of the registrar's office, which once had doors on them. The front desk was empty and trashed, even the desk was broken. "Let's go," said one of us, and we, divided into 2 groups, 2 by 2, headed down the halls, Vazia and I to the left and Gray and Anton to the right. Walking slowly down the corridor, we occasionally kicked the doors open, turning on the lantern and lighting up the next room. Maybe one knows what an adrenaline rush it is to feel like you're alone in a big 3-story building that no one wants, and you can do whatever you want. What happened here anyway? I asked a question to my lagging companion. It was an asylum, but they were doing something weird, like experiments on people. I was getting ready to listen to the story when the jerk slapped me on the shoulder and yelled. I swore and almost hit him in the head with the flashlight. He ran back and laughed and said, "I don't know, they kept the loonies, then they closed the lodge." He said, "I don't think you can get into the archives, they're on the 3rd floor, but I don't think you can get in, there's no stairs." I said I'd keep going. He nodded, and we went our separate ways. I caught a glimpse of some of the rooms. Somewhere there were desks, somewhere they were tattered, somewhere there was snow in the offices because of the broken windows. The linoleum on the floor was torn and full of holes. I went up to the 2nd floor. Apparently these were rooms for ordinary patients. For doctors and attendants there were many large spacious rooms for several people, some even had iron bunks for beds. I went into one such room. It was relatively clean, with a metal chair next to the wall. I went to the window, all of them intact, and behind the glass in the snow I saw footprints leading from the hospital wall into the woods. Where did those guys go? I thought, surprised, but a fright took me out of my thoughts. A shadow flashed and stopped on the wall. Someone was standing in the opening and began to crawl away. I recognized Vazia by the characteristic shaking of his head. and the reflection in the window convinced me that it was him. "Go to hell!" I yelled, turning around sharply. The guy dropped the lantern in fright and tripped over the board and collapsed on the floor. "Oh, you fool," he cried out hysterically, and then I started laughing. I helped him up, and we talked about having the party here. The wind wasn't blowing, it was even warm. More booze, something to keep warm, like a kerosene burner, and then we'll see. "Oh, that doesn't make any sense," said the friend. "In the spring or summer we could do it." "No, we should go to the countryside in the summer," I objected. "We'll see," said Vajia, and we moved on. "Here, let me show you," he said as we passed two whole doors. He pushed one of them open, and it creaked and let in light into the stairwell. On the right were simple stone stairs leading down, and on the left were nothing, just an empty space. "All the stairs are like that," Vajia said. "They left the doors here so people wouldn't get their heads bashed in. Otherwise drunks come and go as they please." "And no one climbed in?" "Yes, they did. One got in, then said that he saw shadows in the corridor, then saw the people from the archives. They asked for help, he moved and killed the whole family." Vajia began to make it up. I clapped him on the shoulder. "You're a great storyteller after all." He laughed and said he'd give me a lift if I wanted to go there. I agreed there was an archive there, and some of the psychiatric hospital sheets can be as frightening as horror movies. After collecting and piling together bricks lying around, planks and other junk, I tried to jump to the stairwell, and when I succeeded, for my height, I climbed up with the help of a friend. There were no doors, and it was very bright in the hallway in front of me. I stepped forward and looked around. Bright corridors, on each side there were a lot of iron doors with spinnerets. All of them were locked, and the wiggles were closed. It must have been the place where they used to keep violently insane patients. I walked further, and came to another shorter corridor. The building was U-shaped. There were more or less well-preserved rooms, some even closed, some with normal doors. The floor was cleaner. You could see that schoolchildren and alcoholics almost never came in here. I moved on. I saw a long corridor with only a few doors. I accelerated my step and moved forward. When I reached the door, I pushed it open and entered the library. Half the cabinets were on the floor, and there weren't many books. It must have been a long time since anyone had been in here after all. The windows were intact, and it was light. I noticed a light switch, and I flicked it clearly. The light wasn't on. I walked further, noticed a heavy wooden door, and pushed it with my foot. It did not give way, and I almost fell from this surprise. I banged on the musty door again and again until I finally kicked it open and entered a room with a massive shelving units, cabinets, and tables. On each shelf were cardboard boxes, some packed, some open, some of them showing papers, some of them scattered on the floor. I walked between the racks and slid the first packed box toward me. It was heavy enough that I decided to take it to the table, so I wouldn't have to fumble in the cramped space. I was just bringing it to the table when something yanked the box, and there was a terrible rumble. The bottom of the box rusted and collapsed, and the cassettes that had been in the box crashed to the floor, rattling wildly. I was frightened, but quickly pulled myself together. Discarding the already empty box, I leaned over the contents. Simple cassettes, already obsolete long ago, large, black, with faded markings, some in pencil, and some in pen on the side. There were numbers, then a fractional sign and more numbers. Apparently, they were videotapes of some kind of medical history. I took 3 of them and scattered them in my jacket pockets. I hoped that these tapes would provide a lot of interesting moments. I also grabbed a couple of rather bulky folders, and had a hard time stuffing them into the inside pockets of my jacket. I lowered myself again in front of the pile of tapes and began to think about what to do with them. As I piled them up, I pushed the pile under the table, and at that moment I noticed a flickering shadow running through the doorway. I could see it on the opposite side of the doorway. Turning my head sharply there, I chortled violently. The thought flashed in my head that it was Vajia playing a joke again, that it could be the watchman, although he was not here in the first place, or a dog of some kind. I jumped to my feet with fright when the cell phone rang. It was Anton. "What are you crawling around in there? Come on down." His voice sounded. "I'll be there soon," I answered and added, "I'll beat up that jerk a bit." "Which one?" "Vaska, I'm tired of him sneaking around." There was silence at the other end, and after a pause Anton said, "There are 3 of us here." Vajia's and Sergei's voices confirmed it, and I was surprised and frightened. Anybody could have been lurking outside the door along the wall, waiting for me. I looked around. There was another doorway besides the front door, and it was closed with a Barbara. I rushed to the exit, and as I ran down the hall, I dropped one of the files. When I got to the stairwell, I was scared again when I realized that I could fall from a great height. There were no stairs. I quickly descended in my arms, jumped to the second floor, and saw some people in front of me, screamed, but then recognized Anton, Gray and Vajia. I inserted the next tape into the VCR, ran the script, and dumped the tape onto a flash drive without stopping playback. While the video was being copied, I opened one of the cases. A certain Vasily with a strange last name, at the time he turned 18, had come to believe that his parents and sister were demons. The diagnosis was chronic paranoid schizophrenia. Voices of angels urged him one night to take his grandfather's shotgun, load it, and shoot all his family. He was arrested and sent to an asylum. Lived in some Lubitchi in the Tver region. It is not clear how he ended up in the Moscow region. Apparently, he was sent for treatment. Attached to the case was a photo, black and white of course. A guy like a guy, only his eyes were rolled up. I was distracted from reading by the movement on the monitor. The video was still playing. There was a silhouette silently shouting, giving signs to the camera, which was installed, apparently, through the door. I was startled by the surprise, but I was filled with pure horror when the girl, she had long hair, started to cut her hands with some sharp object, scratching and wriggling in the most incredible poses, trying to stab herself as hard as she could, while defending herself from something. Then the camera shook and began to film doctors and orderlies running in, tying the girl up, giving her an injection, and her falling asleep. The image disappears. To say that I was frightened is nothing to say. I hurriedly turned the video off. Yes, it was the worst kind of horror. I got ready to show the video to my friends. I finished the rest, and then I saw that the second video was already done. I turned it on too, and prepared to be frightened. The video showed the familiar wall with the calendar and the poster of the brain. The quality of this video was much better. At the table sat a different girl, apparently with blonde hair, and was answering the questions of the same voice, rocking continuously from side to side and biting her lip. Anna. Sometimes my hands light up. That's what worries me. When does it happen? Only when I fall asleep. Is that why you don't sleep? How exactly do they burn? Both palms at once. It's very painful, Ivan Stepanovich. But you don't have burns on your hands. And we can guarantee that your hands won't just burn, you have to sleep. Understand, 2 weeks without sleep is serious. Suddenly the girl panicked. No. I can't. You've never experienced it, that's why you say that. This kind of conversation went on for several minutes, with a rambling answer to each question she had. Finally, the doctor said, "Okay, I'll give you some pills now, and you can be transferred to regular patients." Not sleeping pills? Anna quickly and frightenedly spoke up. No, just a sedative. The girl nodded her head in thought. I looked closely. Yes, her eyes were closed. The rustling of the pencil stopped. There was a tense silence. Anna, the doctor called loudly. She, as on cue, raised her head and, immediately lowering her eyes to her hands, screamed loudly. I twitched at this horrible shriek and turned off the speakers. When I looked at the monitor again, I saw Anna in a semi-conscious state rushing from corner to corner of the office, waving her arms, and apparently screaming. The doctor jumped up, a moment later rushed orderlies, took away the tearing girl. The man in the white coat walked to the table and sat down at it. I turned on the speaker. A voice was heard. This time there were first-degree burns on the patient's hands. Possibly suggestion. He started listing the diseases again, and I scrolled the tape away. When I got to one point, I was frightened and almost screamed. The camera was filming a body dangling in a noose. There was no doubt that it was Anna. Then the footage showed the body being placed on the couch, the camera shot in passing the iron door with the volley, and after that came the ripples. I turned off the record player and, with music on, began leafing through the second folder of the patient's file. It described a case of split personality, with another small file for each personality. I started reading. There was written about a woman who, under certain circumstances, was the humblest girl, under others, worked quietly as a prostitute, having her own apartment. Her third alter ego was a dog, which she turned into when she got into the basement of her house. In her case, all ended relatively well. She recovered. It turned out, all detailed in the file, that when she was 5 years old, her mother often locked her in the basement of the house for several days, and her older brother demanded that she meet his sexual needs in exchange for food. A year later the neighbors found out, and the girl was taken away. When she became an adult, these incidents had completely faded from her memory. On the last back was a sheet of paper with two numbers separated by a fractional sign. The same slips, but with different numbers, were in the other cases. I realized they were tape numbers, so I decided to go get them tomorrow. I decided that was enough for today, so I went to bed. The first thing I did in the morning was to dump the tapes onto a flash drive, and call Vajia with the suggestion of going back to the asylum for more stories, which I immediately told him about. He rejected the idea in a sleepy voice, and said he would just watch the tapes and not go. And Anton and Gray aren't likely to go, he said, warning me to call them. Why not? I think so. I called them too. They really refused to go, even though it was daytime. I decided to go alone, got dressed, took a lantern, a knife just in case, and as I was taking it, I remembered the shadow that had run by then. I got scared, so I added a bat to the knife, hiding it under my jacket. It was small but heavy with a lead core. I locked the apartment and headed for the hospital. It was lunchtime when I got there and went inside. Still the same hallway, same reception area. I walked down the left hallway, made my way to the stairs, and went up to the second floor. Just about to step on the stairs to the third floor, I got scared and remembered that there were no stairs, and I would have to either stomp home for a hinged or think about what to do. I started thinking. Walking home for about a kilometer would not do, so I had to look for something. I fetched 10 bricks and a wood stand from the first floor, put the bricks on top of each other lengthwise, put the stand on top of them. There was a good chance I would fall, but I was lucky and grabbed the edge of the stairwell. Next I pulled myself up on my hands and climbed up it. I pulled out my bat and stepped out into the familiar bright hallway. It was just like before. Flakes of snow flickered outside the window, and the window itself was stained and dirty. I walked to the archives with my bat at the ready and pushed the door open. It opened with a creak, and I looked at the familiar room. The tapes were still lying by the table, and all the boxes were in place. It looked like no one had been in this place after me. I went into the room. No one. I looked at the opaque green curtain covering the passage, no movement either, but the curtain frightened me again. Why was it hanging there? After all this time it would either have been torn down, or it would have torn itself. So someone must have put it there. I yelled out, "Hey, if there's somebody here, come out, I'm not going to hurt you." There was silence in response. I realized what an idiot I must look now, and leaned over to the tapes, picking out the right ones. And the right ones were the ones whose numbers were written in the patient files. I found them by the half-worn inscriptions with a pen and put them in my backpack, having previously thrown 3 more tapes and 5 more cases in there. I was about to leave when I glanced at the curtained doorway. I stepped closer to it, terrified. When I yanked it aside, I saw a square room, completely empty, with no sign of human presence. Even after shining the flashlight, there was no door or hatch, and why should there be? I calmed down and headed for the exit. Again I thought that someone was waiting for me behind the door, but again there was no one there. As I walked down the corridor, I suddenly stopped, sensing some sort of unease that kept building up. I turned around. There were no silhouettes in the bright window light, no one running through. The linoleum was clean. It was this cleanliness that reminded me that when I ran out of here yesterday, I had dropped one folder, and now it was gone. I felt creepy, but I had a bat in my hand, so I decided to find out what was going on here after all. I walked from door to door in the left wing, pushing the doors: the warehouse, the archive, the library. In the library, on the table, my attention was caught by a blank object. Everything around it was covered with a layer of dust, and it stood out for its cleanliness. I went into the library and picked up the item. It was a flash drive. The most ordinary flash drive, 16 gigabytes, apparently intact. It made me laugh. Apparently, someone who had been in here before me had forgotten it, and now I could be in possession of hours of pornography, tons of movies or music, and just a good flash drive. I took it and headed for the exit. After jumping down the stairwell to the second floor, I went downstairs and out into the street. After breathing in some fresh air, I went home. At home, I dumped the contents of my backpack on the floor, separated the cases, and placed them on the table, putting the tapes in front of the VCR. At the same time, I began searching the internet for information about the local asylum. There wasn't much information, but I went to some website, where it was described in detail. There was also written that there is not enough information, because the hospital is not used for a long time, and the data about it are kept mainly in books and journals. However, it was still written that the hospital had been hastily closed after some unpleasant incident that had occurred there. The hospital was not an ordinary hospital, something unusual was investigated there. Here I remembered how the girl spontaneously appeared burns on the palms of her hands, but then the research was shut down. "Yeah, Tinny," I muttered, and inserted the flash drive into the computer. It recognized it, the menu popped up, and I copied the entire contents onto the computer. The flash drive was almost full. While the data was being copied, I went to the tapes. The first tape was of the guy who killed his whole family. I put it in the tape recorder and turned it on in a jiffy. The quality was terrible again. You could barely see the man in a straitjacket, and you could only hear his voice through the interference. I will have to copy this recording to the computer and process it. I went to the computer. The data had already been copied, so I decided to put it off for the time being. I looked curiously into the folder. About 100 video files, about 5 minutes long each. Wow! I blurted out and started the first one. A chair appeared on the screen and a girl with her hands on the table in front of her. She was looking at one point and rubbing something with her fingers. Her hands were visibly cut, and bandages were visible above her elbow. "What was your name?" That voice made me feel a pressure in my stomach area. Yes, these were definitely the tapes I had seen, only here they were in excellent quality, though in black and white. Angelina Pavlova Andreevna, I was surprised, they usually introduce themselves by putting the last name first. What's bothering you so much? I pressed the space bar. Playback stopped. I was scared out of my mind. Suppose someone had collected all the tapes before me, only then did I notice that the tapes had the same numbers as the ones on the tapes, except for the last ones, edited them and improved them, and in one of the hikes had forgotten the flash drive on the third floor. But why didn't he come? Maybe it was his shadow that flashed then? I started thinking and decided that thought was correct, because there were no other options. I skipped to the end of the tape. Towards the end I found that scene again, where the girl was hitting the walls, the muffled sound of blows could be heard, she was starting to cut and stab herself, at the same time defending herself from the attack of the spirit. I turned the player down and started the next tape. There was already a very young girl sitting at the table, almost a teenager, and in a foul-mouthed manner, with active gesticulation and big eyes, she was chanting about how people were constantly walking around her, helping her, telling her many things. "Tell me, who let you out of your cell?" the doctor asked. Well, a friend of mine did. I asked him to, and he did, and helped me out, and told me where the doctors were, and distracted them with knocks and shadows, and I left, she laughed. The doctor took quick notes of everything, then asked, "Are there a lot of them? How often do you see them?" "There are many, very often I see them." "Now one tells me you forgot your cigarettes at home, ah ha 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 ha." The doctor hummed and ordered his assistant to take the girl away. When they came out, he pulled back the desk drawer and mouthed for the record, "No cigarettes. Apparently, I either dropped them or forgot them at home." I stopped the playback. Judging by the number of recordings, they would have been enough for the Second Great Wall of China. I turned on the next tape. A girl of about 25 showed up again, short-cropped and with dark hair. I looked at the date 90s. The past ones were 89. Yep, so the further back, the later the records. I turned off the player and started the tape about 3/4 of the way through. The tape turned out to be in color, with a girl I already knew sitting in the chair. Yes, she was the one who had seen people. She was just smiling now, grown up. "Tell me, what do people say to you now?" I heard the familiar, slightly thickened voice. "That it will all be over soon." "What is it?" "They're letting me out." "But you know that as long as you can hear them, we can't let you out." "I know." This conversation went on for several minutes. I stopped the playback and went to the last recording. It was already in great quality, rich color, good sound. There was a woman in her 40s sitting at the table, but looking good, who was talking with tears in her eyes. They were there again today. I heard their footsteps. "Were they breaking in on you?" "No, they were just walking around." "I'm really scared." "Do you have strong doors?" "What if they come in?" the woman cried. "No, the doors are good, don't worry. But you can handle them yourself. Remember that demon that came into your room one night? You defeated him, didn't you?" "Yes, I did. Then you can do it this time too. Just be ready." "Okay, Next, the girl was seen leaving the room, no one accompanying her. The doctor sits in silence for a while, then stands up, the camera jiggles, and she approaches the door. Apparently he forgot to turn it off. I began to look more closely. Clean gray linoleum, the camera was tilted down and filming it. Suddenly the doctor apparently noticed that the camera was working and, lifting it up, turned it off. The playback ended, but I managed to notice in the last frame some light stain on the floor of the hospital corridor. I threw the video into the program and watched the last second frame by frame. Here the camera quickly picked up, and in the distance I blurred an object lying on the floor. The next frame was clear and I almost cried out. There was a folder on the floor, which I had dropped the first time I had escaped from there. I jumped up. Yes, it was definitely the folder. Some papers had even spilled out of it. It wasn't there today, so it must have been taken yesterday. Having recovered from the shock, I sat down again at the computer and started the video with the title 1 out of 10. Again the same quality. The same office again. Again the girl at the desk, but a different one. She tells the same doctor there is something under her skin. Who? I don't know. Worms, maybe? I can feel them crawling. When do you feel that? When I'm alone for a long time. The whole tape went on and on about this conversation. I switched to the next one. Then the third one. On the fourth one, I got scared when I saw this girl's face. It was all torn up, apparently with fingernails, and the girl was crying and complaining that the worms had gotten to her. I shifted on in fear. There were fewer scratches, and the girl was calm. I skipped to the eighth tape and hiccuped as the girl's face was a bloody wound. From the looks of it, the wounds had been inflicted by a nail or a piece of iron, but whatever the case, her face was horrible. I felt myself breathing intermittently, and tears were coming to my eyes. The next recording was of snow, a path trampled in the snow leading to the house, the sound of 2 pairs of feet crunching in the snow. The recording lasted 5 seconds. I stood up in horror. The damnation going on in this town was over the top. The doorbell rang suddenly, sending chills down my spine again. Looking through the peephole, I saw Vajya and opened the door, letting him into the apartment. He asked why I was so pale, and I showed him these 10 notes in sequence. He looked through them silently while I poured tea in the kitchen. When I came in, he was sitting with bulging eyes, breathing heavily. "What is it?" I asked. "I know her, she is my neighbor, she left for Moscow a month ago." I was taken aback by his words. "Call the police." He shouted, but there was no police squad in the city. Normally they would have been called from the one next door, but because of the weather it would have been hard to get to us. There was a year's worth of snow. "What should we do?" he asked. From the look on his face he wasn't lying, and it really was his neighbor. It was getting darker and darker. We called Anton and Sergey to rush over to us. We showed them the footage. They closed their eyes in horror as the girl tried to say something with her torn mouth and only blinked her torn lashes. The last video, of the terrified woman, shocked all 3 of them when I told them I had dropped the folder when I was running away from there and it wasn't there today. We began to consult. Anton's father had a pistol from World War II, and Anton promised to grab it. I took the bat, Vajya carried the camera, Gray just walked along for company. We could have waited until morning or called for more senior people, but we were afraid that we would just attract the attention of the man who continued to operate in the hospital. So we sneaked into the hospital in secret. When we waited 15 minutes later for Anton with a gun, we found ourselves in the now familiar lobby. All 4 of us turned on our flashlights and looked around. Everything was the same, everything was the same. Vajya turned on the camera. It was hard to see, but at least the sound was being recorded. We walked down the corridor, climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, and stopped in the stairwell. In about 5 minutes the 3 of us climbed to the 3rd floor, setting each other up. Anton stayed downstairs with his gun. We went out into the corridor. It was strangely warm in here, despite the winter. We stepped quietly across the floor, illuminating the floor and walls. Vajya noticed a few drops on the floor. We squatted down and began to look at them. Simple dark droplets, thick, unfrozen, gray in color. We moved on. still the same doors. I knocked fearfully on one of them and put my ear to the door. Everyone held their breath. Silence. We looked around at the door. There was no lock or bolt on it, just like on the wobbler, as if the door had been blocked or locked from the inside. Strange, we decided. Suddenly a strong lantern light came on from the side. We were frightened, for neither of us had one. The lantern lowered, and we saw a man in a shabby guard's uniform, middle-aged, short, tired. "What the hell are you doing here?" he asked in a sleepy voice. He had obviously been asleep recently, and his face looked strangely familiar to me. I also found it suspicious that he was asleep when it was -10 degrees and the building was unheated. "There's nothing to steal here now, except these doors," he kicked the iron door. "We're just fooling around," said Vajia. "Come on, I'll tell you what's going on, not having to stand around in the cold." "You've woken him up, you know." "Excuse me," said Vajia, and we followed the watchman. All except me. I said I would look for Anton, and I went the other way. As we left, I heard my friends and the watchman talking. "How are we going to get down? There's no stairs." "I usually put mine." "Are there only 4 of you?" "Yes." I went down on my hands to the second floor and shouted, "Anton!" "What?" came from somewhere downstairs. "Come up, we've been compromised." "By whom?" "The local watchman." I heard Anton's footsteps, then I saw the lantern. He was coming upstairs. He came up to me and said, "What janitor? He hasn't been here since closing time." I was surprised and suddenly it jerked me. I recognized the guard. The face on the tape I was watching was pretty hard to see, but I compared it to the photo. Yes, it was him. The same simple country face, the same bulging eyes of a maniac who had gone mad and shot his entire family with his grandfather's hunting rifle. I rushed to the second staircase. Anton, readying his gun, followed me. We went down to the first floor. It was quiet. Footsteps could be heard from somewhere below. We turned to the stairs and shined the flashlight there. A guard appeared in the light and, covering his face from the lantern light, asked, "Anton and his friend?" We lowered the lanterns. The guard took his hand away from his face. "Yes, that was him." "Where are they?" I asked. The watchman smiled wickedly and said, "I'm going to clean you anyway, you bastards." He didn't have time to get his gun out of his jacket. Anton shot him in the leg, and he fell, spinning like a whirligig. My ears squeaked with the sound of the gunshot, and we ran down the stairs after our friends. We entered the dark basement. A flashlight found an object in the corner, covered with a tarpaulin. It turned out to be a generator. I started pulling the rope while Anton stood on guard, and finally the generator started. Light spilled over the room. It turned out to be a morgue. It was spacious, with stone arches, a mass of notches in the walls, and a huge, white iron door at the end. I went to the first notch and yanked the handle. Something like a shelf rolled out. Anton went over too. There was something on the shelf, covered with a sheet. It was a body, there was no doubt about it. The outline of the head, the torso, the arms. We looked no further. I felt dizzy. What was a body doing here, if the hospital had been closed for 15 years? Anton slowly picked up the bedspread and yanked it away sharply. As he did so, I was a little distracted, as I thought I heard someone knocking at the other end of the morgue. But when I turned my head, I screamed in horror. On the shelf lay the very same girl with her face horribly torn open, her eyes and mouth open, but the scariest part was that her legs had been cut off. Completely. Anton stood in a stupor, and I quickly pushed the shelf back and brought him to his senses. "We need to find Vajia and Sarah." My words to him were interrupted by a groan and a knock at the other end. Anton heard them too, and we rushed over there, additionally lighting the way with lanterns. We reached the furnace. Yes, it was a crematorium, a huge, wide, riveted door. You could burn a bull in such an oven. We lifted the deadbolt and opened it. 2 giant worms spilled out of the open door, dust spewing from them. Something hissed. The worms hissed and started coughing. It was our friends who had gotten dirty in the crematorium ash. And the gas hissed, a pungent, irritating smell that Anton and I also smelled, quickly locking the door and lifting our friends up. "Let's go," muttered Vasya, and we headed for the exit. We kept the generator running and went up to the first floor. The guard was already gone. We were startled and saw that the blood trail led to the second floor. Vasya and Sergei dissuaded us from going there, but the 4 of us went up anyway. My friends told us that there was a huge cauldron in the crematorium, and with a lighter they could see human bones in it. To this story we followed the trail. The trail led to the other wing. Stepping carefully, we walked along it. Our adversaries knew the building better, and the scariest part was that we didn't know who it was or how many of them there were. Maybe it was one lunatic, or maybe there were hundreds of them. The trail led to a stairwell and up a leaning ladder. We took it up to the 3rd floor. It was eerily dark, and the lights were starting to go down. The trail led us to the junction of 2 wings of the building, to an office with a normal door. We looked around. No one was there. We started kicking at the door. It was beginning to give way, until Anton reminded us that the guard had a gun that we had forgotten to take from him. We stopped in indecision, stepping sideways away from the door. I turned my back to the door and kicked it open with a crack. We stood like that for about a minute, hesitant to even look in. Finally, agreeing by signs, we jumped into the office together, shining the flashlights. No one was there. The blood trail was crossing into a puddle under a chair. Apparently someone had helped him, and that someone was a doctor. Anton stood outside the door while we fumbled around in the clean office. I sat down at the desk. Yes, it was the same office that kept appearing in the records, there was no doubt about that. There was a computer, hooked up to an uninterruptible power supply, apparently powered by the generator in the morgue. It reminded me of the last name Churina. I asked Vasya and Gray if they knew one. They said they didn't. "Anton, and you?" I shouted. While he was walking, I opened the drawers in the desk. In one was another flash drive and the keys. Sergei found a big camera in the closet. "Some kind of maniac," he said with feeling. "What am I?" asked Anton, looking into the room. "Do you know Churina?" "Well, yes, it's my mother's maiden name. Why?" I confess, I was horrified by those words. "I've heard of her." "What happened to her?" "She died in childbirth." "Oh. Yeah, it all made sense." The recording was made in 1989, it's 2011. Anton will be 21 this year, he was in the army, hence the gun wielding. He's a native of this town. Yes, his mother was here. I took the keys and we left the office. It was completely dark. It was like the world had been flooded with black paint. We made our way to the cells for the insane. With difficulty I found the keyhole, and with even more difficulty, I found the right key in the bundle. The lock clicked, the heavy door creaked, and I ran to the side no matter what might have escaped. But it was quiet. I peeked in. No one was there. A toilet, a couch, a cloth on the couch, a metal table embedded in the wall next to it. And no one. We moved on to the next door. My nerves were at their limit, and Vasya said, "Maybe we should come back tomorrow? No matter what, it's dark now, and that watchman is running around somewhere. With a gun." We unanimously decided that it was a good idea and quickly left the third floor, taking the keys. We quickly got out of the hospital and went to my place. When we arrived, we warmed up with some beer, partially purchased for the party. Vajia and Grace separately went to the bathroom to wash off the corpse ashes. And I decided to show Anton the tape with his mother. He was tensely silent the whole time. When the playback ended, he said, "Is that all?" "Yes." "Where's her file?" I really did have my aunt crash. It's a nightmare. I don't know, it's in the archives, I guess. I'm sorry. When the four of us got together, I plugged the flash drive into the computer. There were only 3 videos, but they shed a little bit of light on what was going on in the hospital. The first video showed a maniac sitting in a chair being bandaged. The video is short, 15 seconds. The second video showed the same room as when the patients were being questioned, only there was a maniac instead of the patient. You have to clear them out. They think you're stupid, but you know a lot. The doctor insisted. I can't touch them, I need a gun or fire. I put the gun in your room. Don't cook them, collect them. Don't give them a chance to report you or there will be hundreds of them. Remember what you did to your family's demons, bring light into the world. For about 5 minutes the doctor brainwashed the sick man until he got up and left. Terrible, Gray commented on what he saw. But the real horror was in the third video. The doctor, apparently, was the cameraman and filmed the watchman sawing off the girl's dead body with a wood hacksaw, one by one, with a nasty thud, as on a rotten board, and loud as on a tree, as it hit the bones, and then stacked them side by side on the floor. When he had finished this, he covered the corpse with a sheet and slid the shelf shut, then took an axe and chopped each leg in the knee area, stacked it all on his hands like firewood, and moved toward the crematorium. The operator followed him. In the open door of the furnace was a cauldron, huge, taking up about half the furnace. The watchman stacked the stumps in the cauldron, and you could hear them bubbling in the water. Then the furnace was closed, some switches and levers were turned, and flames started shooting out of the furnace through the gap between the door and the wall. After about 5 minutes of this filming, the lever was turned again, the door was open, and steam was pouring out of the furnace. The cameraman's voice was heard, and we recognized the doctor's voice. Appetizing, he inhaled the steam. The patients will be pleased. That was the end of the tape. Sergey and Vajia, who were gradually turning green throughout the video, snapped into the bathroom, and already from there came the distinctive sounds. Anton and I just looked at each other. We decided to go to bed. A thought flashed through my mind that the maniac could have tracked us down, but I shook it off. In the morning we woke up in one piece, but late for the institute it was already Monday. We were not particularly upset, as we had more interesting things to do than the institute. We got ready and equipped, and headed for the hospital. When we began to approach it again, we noticed something strange on the 3rd floor of the hospital. The windows were strangely clean, as if washed bright. Noting this to ourselves, we made our way inside. We noticed snow in the hallway. It was suspicious. Clumps of snow were here and there, and they looked like footprints. We quickly made our way up to the 3rd floor, and down the corridor along the metal doors. When I glanced to the end of the corridor, I noticed that the door to the office was closed. We went to the first door we saw, and I put the key in. To everyone's surprise, the door opened easily. Even without a key, it was unlocked. We cautiously stepped inside. Along the wall was an iron bench, embedded in the wall, with a mattress on it. On the side was a hand wash basin and a toilet, and a smudged mirror. On a metal table there was a plate with the remains of a slurry, in which we identified what had been cooked in the crematorium, and what had been dripped in front of the door. We dispersed into the cell, though it was small. On the walls I saw a massive strange drawing scratched out with a nail, and there were also words that looked more like incantations to ward off evil spirits. Under the window was a dark cloth that apparently covered it. I had no doubt that it was the chamber of that girl who was afraid of demons. But what was the demon she had defeated? There was a hammer lying underneath the bed. We left the strange room and went to the next one. That one, too, was unlocked and surprisingly easy to open, like a greased one. Everything in this room was exactly the same as in the last cell, except for the bloody floor beside the bed and the marks of bloody palms on the walls. The mirror was broken, with blood and scraps of cloth on its shards. Along the wall there were wide bloody streaks. Without talking to each other, we somehow realized at once that a girl who had torn her face off had lived here. She had cut her face with the shards, tearing it off, running it along the wall. Creepiness. Suddenly we all jumped as the cell door slammed shut. "What the?" yelled Anton and pushed the door with his foot. The door wouldn't open and we started to panic, until I remembered the keys and opened the door from the inside. We got out. There was no one around, but there was no draft to close the door either. Anton had his gun at the ready as we opened the doors one by one. They were all the same, empty, with only a cot, table, toilet, wash basin. Only in one room the cot was not embedded in the right, but in the left wall, and I immediately recognized the room where the girl who was afraid of her flammable hands had hanged herself. She had hanged herself from a pipe that for some reason passed in the room above. We also saw the maniac's room. The mattress was in the corner, the doors were scratched with fingernails apparently. He had raged quite well in his time. We reached the last cell, the walls of which were covered with notebook sheets with drawings. This surprised us, so we began to look at them. Simple children's drawings, some silhouettes around a child. There was a sign above the child, Katya. Exactly. That's the same girl who saw spirits all around her. I noticed one piece of paper that caught my attention. I ripped it off the wall and began to read. Today is January 28, 2011. It surprised me a lot because it was today. Which means you are already reading this letter. You've seen the notes with me, and you know I'm not going to lie now. If you get that, then know this: we're already dead. You have to find us. People who died even earlier tell me. All you know about this building is enough. Just don't be afraid and take your friends on your journey, they'll help you. Our souls will rest once our tormentor has been punished. Wow. I muttered. What? My friends asked me, and I gave them the leaf. Gray, twisting it in his hands, asked, "So what?" "So what? Read it." "There's nothing to read, it's blank." I took it in my hands. It was blank, which made me dumbfounded. We got out and went into the study. It wasn't locked, but we didn't find a camera in the closet. "So he was here," said Anton. They began to discuss where the maniac might have gone and where the sick people were, while I was absorbed in my thoughts. This girl knows that I will help her. Consequently, she knows how. Everything you know about the building. What does that mean? All I need to do is move myself. And where's that guard? So, what do I know about the building? Well, it was built in the 80s, closed down in about 95. There was talk that the government was investigating people's supernatural abilities, like the girl whose palms lit up or the one who saw ghosts. I went to the window and thought. The snow was already falling in flakes and swirling strangely near the window, as if inviting me to look outside. I looked, and then I was shaken. I recognized the path outside. It was on the last tape with the girl who tore her face off. I turned around and told my friends about it. They were totally supportive of my idea of following this trail. We had a gun. We quickly made our way outside, walked around the building, and down the trail. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I remembered the notes. My friends were quiet, too, and walked in earnest. We walked along the trail for about 15 minutes until we came upon a small house in the woods. There was smoke coming from the chimney. We decided to go in. There was a stove in the only room, and a man in a white coat was sitting next to it. He turned his head toward us, and we saw his face, the face of a mad genius, with glistening eyes and gritted teeth. He laughed so loudly that we ran out into the street and ran in terror for about a minute, until we stopped and asked each other what it was, reality or hallucination. When we dared to come to the cabin again, it was empty. We followed the footprints from it for about 50 meters more and saw some kind of machine, like a sawmill, absolutely covered with blood and some scraps. The blood was a hot puddle that melted into the snow around it. Vajia vomited, and we looked at the structure with horror, and were afraid to accept the thought that several people had been lowered into the trough and cut to pieces, then cut again and finally turned into a red slurry that rippled in the pit where it all poured out. The crackle of twigs made us jerk sharply toward the source of the sound. It was the doctor. Giggling mockingly, he uttered in a mocking voice, "Yes, it was me. I was the one who asked them to go down there for the release. And they went, they went. One by one, and your mother, Aunt Osha, who was afraid of demons, and the fortune teller, they all went. And your uncle, Vajia, and he wanted too." "What nonsense, I have no uncle!" Vajia shouted. "Naive boy. Do you really believe that your relatives will tell you how your uncle killed all his relatives? You are even named after him. And your mother," he turned to Anton, "do you think she is sinless? She killed a bum with a hammer while he was walking on the 3rd floor. And she could have killed the one who wandered there the day before yesterday, and we would have made soup out of him too." After these words, I felt something turn over in my stomach, because I was the one who had walked there. And then I remembered that on the tape the woman had said someone had been walking around the door. Liar. I'm not from around here. Ha ha ha. Cackled the lunatic. Fool, do you think they would have left you here? There was a shot that interrupted the madman's speech. Anton fired his pistol, but missed. The lunatic chuckled and said, "Don't try, son. Daddy will do everything himself." Dad? Fuck you. You don't like my joke? The psycho pulled out a box of matches. Only now everyone noticed the smell of gasoline and the psycho's wet clothes. And I thought it would be fun, and he lit a match. The pillar of fire stood still for a while, but then started running through the woods, screaming and rolling around on the ground. Anton wanted to shoot it, but Vajia put his hand down, let him suffer. After a minute, the lunatic fell silent and was only fuming. We sighed with relief and, trying not to look at the creepy machine 10 meters away, turned back. "Go back to hell, bitches." A crazy voice came from the side of the machine. But no one had time to react except Anton, who swiftly grabbed his gun and fired in the direction of the voice. The bullet ricocheted off the metal, sparks flew into the psycho's face, and he collapsed into the pit, splashing out thick blood, rags, some black bits and hair on the snow near the pit. We hurried to get away from there. That was the story. The cops poked at us for a while, then let us go, even issued a commendation.